All right, good morning, everybody. While I was putting this lecture together, I was talking to a colleague and mentioning how it seems that everything that I'm finding to put up either has to do with something terrible happening in the present or in the past. Whether it's people dying of, malnutrition or horrible things taking place in Syria. So he sent me something. He's like, well, why don't you show them this, which I thought was pretty funny. Just to kind of highlight why we have problems understanding the Middle East and our news sources. This is a screenshot from Dutch television, TV2, in talking about Syria and the conflict there. They're actually using, or they were until they realized their mistake, scenes from the video game Assassin's Creed. So anyway, he thought that was amusing. I thought it was funny too. All right, we're going to pick up where we left off last time with not the Hittites. We'll get to the Hittites, but we're going to continue talking about this Hurrian state, the Mitanni state, that emerges in the north after the fall of Shemshi-Adad, after the fall of Hammurabi, in this new period that we're looking at in depth now, the late Bronze Age, which dates again to around 1600 to 1200 BCE. We looked at the city of Alalak, which again is right here, in depth last time. We saw some of the sculpture that comes from this period. One of the rulers of Alalak, King Adrimi, who ruled around 1480 BCE. Again, a vassal king, as this empire, this Mitanni Empire, is a confederation of city-states that comes together rather loosely. We looked at the palace at Alalak. We saw a few new developments there, right? Some of the same standard elements that we've come to expect in a palace: an archive room, a central courtyard. Again, right? Not just a residence for the ruler, but an administrative complex for regulating trade, regulating the rule of law as well. But some new things as well, right? This is North Syria. Just jump back to our map here. We can see, right, very much out on the periphery of Mesopotamia. And so we see some very curious things taking place. We talked about the Bit Halani last time. You guys remember what the Bit Halani is? What was the Bit Halani, this guy right here up on the board? Very typical of Syrian-style palaces. Yeah?
Isn't it the portico column-like entrance?
Right, yeah, this is this columned entrance. We can see the use of columns going back as early as Ebla, but in this case with these North Syrian palaces, like the one at Alalak, we see these columned entrances, these porticos. Again, this is a region that has a lot of timber, for one thing, so we expect to see more columns, but it's a very specific trait of these palaces. You can see columned porticos here and here in this annex of the palace. Also in the previous palace that we looked at, right, the palace of Yarm Lin, which is contemporary with the palace of Mari, we see the use of columned porticos, for example, right here, and a lot of parallels between these two palaces that we looked at last time, these stepped entrances. The courtyards, right, which serve to separate public space and private space. And also the use of stone orthostats and flanking lions. We see this at Alalak for the first time. These are North Syrian traditions that are going to come later on to be very important in Mesopotamia proper. But for right now, we're seeing them in Alalak in the northwest, and specifically with the Mitanni. So that was Alalak. We're going to continue looking at some of these other sites. Remember, the capital of the Mitanni Empire, Washukani, is our second great missing capital. We don't know where it is. It's thought maybe to be here, Tel Fakhariya, but again, there isn't any conclusive evidence that this is the capital. We do know it by name, though. But what we know mostly about Mitanni comes from these sites on the periphery, Alalak and also the site of Nuzi. So Nuzi is much closer, as you can see, to the Mesopotamian heartland. And at Nuzi, we find a temple, actually it's a city. Texts actually describe it as a walled city that was so vast that individual streets were named So for example, this main street which separates out the palace, which you can see here, this massive construction, again, a series of courts and public chambers, private chambers, administrative rooms, separated out by a massive wall and residential districts right on the other side of it. So a very urban palace. Again, this site was first discovered by a number of tablets being found at the site that were sold into the antiquities market. They showed up, and this is how, unfortunately, a lot of sites are found. Artifacts start circulating, and they're sold, and questions get asked, where did this come from? Oh, it came from Jürgen Tepe. Oh, okay, well, let's go check this out. And sure enough, 5,000 sealed tablets were uncovered at this palace, and this massive Mitanni administrative city was discovered. The tablets cover over 5 or 6 generations of private families that ruled at Nuzi. And again, this is a vassal kingdom, a kingdom that had local authority, just like Alalakh did in the west, but answered ultimately to the capital of the Mitanni state at Washukani, wherever that may be. You can see the palace, again, is modeled on at least these public areas, a tripartite plan with a central courtyard here and a large open space. I should say that there are 2 major courtyards, and unfortunately much of this palace is missing. But you can see we've got 2 major courtyards. One is M94 here, and another one is the second interior courtyard is M100. These massive central courtyards. And probably we would have had an entrance to the palace somewhere up here. We don't have that, unfortunately. You can see this plan is quite different than the palace of Niqmempa at Alalakh, even though they're contemporary. In fact, for example, there are no orthostats used at Nuzi. There are no Beit Halani at Nuzi. Even the layout is much more reminiscent of nearby palaces, palaces in the east, palaces like Mari that precede this palace at Nuzi. Everything from the paved courtyards and just the general plan. We can see, of course, we looked at Mari in depth, right? Entering our first courtyard, a central room, an archive room, which would separate out our second courtyard, the Court of the Palms, before you finally make your way into the heart of the palace at Mari. Well, we see something similar happening here at Nuzi. If our entry is here, right, here's our first courtyard, this central archive room delineating the space between them, a second courtyard leading into, again, what probably is a series of throne rooms and administrative complexes. So again, Nuzi, while this is all part of the Mitanni state, these local rulers are still building in the traditions that they've emerged from. So Nuzi is very much an Eastern style, Mesopotamian style palace. We have some other interesting developments during this period. If you remember the investiture scene of Zimri Alim, during the Middle Bronze Age, at the end of the Middle Bronze Age, we're starting to see increasing cultural contact and long-distance trade. We've talked about long-distance trade since the very beginning, right? Lapis lazuli coming from Afghanistan. But now more and more we're seeing connections not to the far east, but also to the far west. Connections with, say, Greece, connections with Crete. It's during this period, in this transition from, now we're in the late Bronze Age, but with Mari, with Nuzi, we see the increasing use of foreign motifs, for example, that come from, say, Minoan civilization at Crete, places like Knossos. This is a Minoan sarcophagus dating to around 1500 BCE. And you can see the artistic parallels here, right? Not just the use of color, but for the first time, these very interesting geometric shapes, borders, swirls, which we find at Nuzi during this time, even earlier at the Palace of Mari under the reign of Zimri Lim. But not just Minoan motifs, right? But also we have Egyptian motifs. being brought into this composition. You can see here this Hathor iconography, right? Hathor, who is a goddess, an Egyptian goddess of fertility, among other things, is often depicted as a cow with horns. She is female, after all, but she does have horns, even though it's typically relates to a bull. But we see here, right, this mixing and this playing with international motifs, a cosmopolitanism, really, that would have been, very evident to all the foreign visitors coming to this palace. They would have walked in and seen, these friezes running around the palace at Nuzi, at places like Mari, even earlier. Again, this borrowing of motifs, this borrowing of traditions is something we see at the end of the Middle Bronze Age, and especially as we move into the Late Bronze Age, which we're going to talk about this week, well, today, and then also next week. The final site we're going to look at in terms of Mitanni is, we're going to go back to Tel Brak, right here. And at Tel Brak, it's actually the only major settlement in the Mitanni heartland that has been excavated. And at it, we see some interesting developments. There's a temple and a palace complex that have been excavated there. These were built at the same time, used at the same time, probably around 1550 or so. And the palace, as you can see, is much smaller than the palaces at Nuzi, or even Alalakh for that matter, but just absolutely massive. It's built almost like a fortress. We see, again, the use of a central courtyard, this paved central courtyard, like what we see at Nuzi. However, again, most of this seems to be public space. It looks like there are these large reception rooms, a throne room in the back, all these traits we've come to expect, but no private quarters. So the excavators thought that, in this case, what we might be looking at Tel Brak, that separation between public space and private space, has less to do with, the courtyard, but has to do with the levels. Because again, look at these massive, massive walls. We're looking at a structure. I mean, these walls are 4 to 5 meters thick. So this is certainly something that is built to withstand attack, withstand a siege even, and also something that would have multiple levels on top of it, right? So perhaps those private chambers were limited to the upper floors of the palace. And what's fantastic about this site is actually we have tremendous preservation up to about 3 to 4 meters, not just the foundations of this building. So we get a sense of how it was constructed. It actually seems as though at this site there were arched passageways that were put in place, which is something that we don't normally associate with Mesopotamian architecture, but luckily we have preserved at Tel Brak. The temple itself, right here, here's a close-up of it. As you can see, very small, but still preserving all the straight axis elements of temples in the period we've come to expect. The temple is separated from the palace by a very narrow passageway, only about 2.3 meters. You can see the proximity here. Again, perhaps illustrating the connection between our secular and our divine power here. But this temple, as we can see, still retains some of the elements that we've come to expect at Brak, dating to the previous period, the period of Shemshi Adad. Remember, during Shemshi Adad, at sites like Tel Leilan, Tel Rima, right, we saw those wonderful mud brick engaged columns, those spirals, the palm tree motifs. Same thing at Tel Brak. At this later period of time, you can see them locked into the facade here, a variation of the mud brick or niched facade.